Okay, I think we can start. Welcome to this session with Professor Guy Newland, titled Starting Making Sense, Finding Tsongkhapa's Middle Way. Lama Tsongkhapa Institute extends its gratitude to Professor Newland for accepting our invitation to be our speaker today. Thank you for your kindness, for waking up so early to teach us as well.
No problem. Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
This presentation is part of our free Master Program Talks series, which aims to explore Buddhist teachings in depth while providing glimpses into the FPMT Master's Program curriculum. Professor Guy Newland is a renowned scholar of Tibetan Buddhism and a longtime professor of religion at Central Michigan University. Having trained with Jeffrey Hopkins, he has dedicated much of his academic career to translating and interpreting key Buddhist works, especially Tsongkhapa's great treatise on the stages of the path to enlightenment and introduction to emptiness. He has also extended his teachings to address grief and loss, culminating in a deeply moving memoir, A Buddhist Grief Observed, which explores how Buddhist wisdom can guide us through profound sorrow. His writings and teachings combine academic rigor, clarity, and profound humanity. This talk is based on his most recent article published in The Legacy of Tsongkhapa, edited by David Gray, and the Amazon link for it will be sent at the end of the session. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the invitation. I'll just say a few things before I start, and then I'm going to share my screen, which will have a series of PowerPoint slides where you can see the text that it's not exactly the text of the article that I used as the basis for the title for this talk, but it's directly related to it. Now, I can see in the chat that a couple of people are not hearing the Italian translation. So,
For the Italian translation, you can click on the three dots on the bottom right side on the interpretation, and then you choose Italian from it.
okay, so you're studying illumination of the intent, illuminating the intent, Thupten Jinpa's translation of Tsongkhapa's exposition of Chandrakiri's Umalajupa entering the middle way. And chapter 11 of this, as Jinpa has organized it, is on the two truths. It's an important section within the sixth. The sixth ground, of course, is by far the largest part of the text, and deals with emptiness in great detail. It's one of the five major treatments of the philosophy of emptiness that Tsongkhapa wrote during his lifetime, and it's very important. The two truths was the topic that I did my dissertation work on a long time ago. So I've given a lot of talks related to conventional truth and ultimate truth, or however you want to translate those terms. And at very many different Dharma centers, different practice centers, uh, people have asked me a lot of questions to try to understand these things. And one of the questions that I got was, people say, well, what is really the point of the two truths? Because everything I'm studying in the Dharma is helping me in my life in some way, except for this topic of the two truths, which seems too abstract and related to my actual life. Um, and so I just like to start by saying, the point of all this ultimately is to become the very best helpers of other suffering beings that we can be, which we understand to be that's what a Buddha is the vision of the optimal helper of others. And so in particular, we have to become, I would say in English, the kindest people we can be. And in this book, for example, uh, Tsong Chandrakirti famously starts out by talking about how compassion is the most important thing at the beginning, middle, and end of the path in all of the parts of the practice. And of course, this is the teaching of His Holiness the Dalai Lama over and over, whether he's teaching to people who never have any interest in Buddhism or even some hostility toward it, or he's teaching to people who are great scholars, he always puts compassion or some other, or kindness, the good heart, sometimes he said, which um, the very best kind of heart one can have is sort of a literal translation of Ningche from Tibetan. He always puts that in the foreground. It's like whatever else you're understanding about Buddhist philosophy. The point of the practice and the point of the study of the Dharma is to become more effective in our kindness to other beings and more strongly motivated by that. So a question is like, well, how and does the study of the two truths actually help us in that regard? Well, that's what has to be explained because that's really the point of it all. So I'll come back to that. And other thing I'd like to say is that when I look at all the different kinds of Buddhist teachings that we see, within the Gelugpa tradition, within FPMT and in other, what do you say, mm, sister or cousin uh, forms of Buddhism. Um, I look at these things as, in terms of the medical metaphor, that the Buddha is the doctor and the Dharma is the medicine, the Sangha is the nurses and other helpers. And in that regard, there are lots of different medicines in Buddha's Dharma pharmacy. It's not like Buddha just has one medicine, and that's exactly what Tsongkhapa said word for word. This is one very powerful Dharma medicine that has been particularly helpful for me, given the kind of predispositions I have to wanting to have things explained in a clear, way. But other people like paradox and are more attracted to paradox or mystery. And there's other forms of Dharma teachings that can be suitable to them. And so I don't think we have to, on the one hand, value the great uh, fortune, right? The great good karma that we've had to be recipients of Tsongkhapa's teachings and recognize that he's an incredible genius. Um, and at the same time, recognize in a way that His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, does, that there can be very, very different ways to line words up that are helpful to other beings in their practice of the Dharma as well. And the final introductory thing I wanted to say is that I just think that the translator of this book, Thupten Jimba, is an amazing human being. I don't know if any of you've had um, an opportunity to meet him or work with him directly. Um, but who knows who's a bodhisattva and who isn't a bodhisattva? But I would have him, yeah, near the top of my nominee list. He's so wise and caring to people, and unless you've actually, I know you can see his work here. It's an incredibly clear translation of a very difficult text. His he's a great scholar and also a wonderful person. And in this particular book, I would just draw your attention, uh, or not to that you shouldn't overlook his or underestimate his introduction to this book. Um, the it's not very long, but it has a lot in it. Uh, it's quite profound in terms of the things that he explains very briefly in that introduction are things, as he actually points out within the introduction, that many scholars have gotten wrong, and even some that people are still getting wrong down to today. So yeah, it's highly recommended. Okay. Um, let's see. Share screen. I hope everybody is hearing the Italian who needs to hear the Italian. Just a second, I'm getting things set up here. Okay, so I just went over this. Um, so Tsongkhapa gives a brief autobiography. In the first of his five major treatises on Madhyamaka, emptiness, Tsongkhapa includes a four-line mini autobiography in which he says, first, I sought wide and extensive learning. Second, I perceived all teachings as personal instructions. Finally, I engaged in meditative practice day and night, and all these I dedicated to the flourishing of the Buddha's teaching. So this idea that you should have to choose between being a great scholar and being a great yogi is succinctly critiqued or refuted in Tsongkhapa's autobiography. This wide and extensive learning becomes the okay. Somebody, uh, okay. Somebody is wanting to change the, okay. Is everything working at that end? Okay. Um, Yeah. So first, wide and extensive learning. Tsongkhapa studied so much, so many texts with so many different teachers. And then he's actually saying that he did, and thereby suggesting that we should take all of these different Dharma instructions as personal teachings, as like things that were whispered in our ears by the guru. And sometimes that uh, is um, easy advice to take because the teachings seem directly pointed at our hearts. And other times they seem highly intellectual and complicated and a little bit difficult to see how we take it as personal instructions, right? But this is what he's saying. Even more abstruse Dharma teachings are ultimately meant to be personal instructions for transforming our minds. And they're the basis of meditation. This is the crucial thing. You don't just like study these books and then meditate on something else. You meditate on what you've understood and internalized on the basis of studying the texts and so forth, right? So this is a core idea in Tsongkhapa's teachings. So, yeah, I want to outline a little bit the Gelugpa presentation of the two truths, which was the basis of my earliest scholarly work in Tibetan Buddhism, which arose out of my connection with Jeffrey Hopkins, which is mentioned in the introduction, which is sort of just something that I stumbled into when I went to college. I happened to take a class with Jeffrey, and he was bringing Tibetan lamas into the classroom and doing parallel translation from Tibetan with them. And this eventually led to me studying with him in graduate school and learning how to translate, Tibetan philosophical texts, which has been a wonderful thing for me in my life. Um, so in addition to going over that, which is the sort of focus of the 11th chapter of Illuminating the Intent as it's organized here, the presentation of the two truths, I want to look at kind of two problematic issues that come up when we try to understand and teach Tsongkhapa's system about emptiness. And that is, what does it mean really to say that things are mere imputations or mere designations, are merely designated by thought and so forth? Um, that things, if things don't have any intrinsic nature of their own, how are they established? Well, they're established as mere imputations, but they also exist as external objects. So this is a problem to explain. How can things both be mere imputations by thought, but that at the same time there be external to the mind? When people say things are mere imputations by thought, they think you're going in the direction of an idealist system where everything is mind, right? And that's not the Prasangika Madhyamaka system. It's a system where things are mere imputations, right? But there are nonetheless external objects. So I want to say something about that. And then finally, something about how it is that we can have reliable knowledge, how we can say that we have valid cognition or reliable knowledge of conventional phenomena if they don't have any essential nature by which we can, know that this one is cheese and this one is a hat or this one is a dog and this is an airplane. If they don't have any distinguishable nature on their own side, how can we say that we know them? Um, so in terms of the value of of practice for teaching the two truths, the Dalai Lama has said that the two truths is actually he recommends it as a starting point for teaching non-Buddhists about Buddhist philosophy because it can inspire confidence in the Buddha as a teacher and curiosity to learn more to see how system is set up. And I think that's true, although, as I mentioned before, it also has the disadvantage that for some people, it feels a little bit disconnected to their problems in their real lives sometimes. Another advantage, value of the two truths is and this is probably how the construct of the two truths started in the history of Buddhist philosophy, is it allows us to understand and reconcile and benefit from apparently contradictory teachings within the Dharma. Um, so you get this distinction between what sutras, what text passages are definitive and which ones require interpretation. Um, and the Akshayamati Nirdesha Sutra, yeah, links the two truths to this idea, the definitive and the interpretable passages that teach about the ultimate nature of things, right, are definitive and other ones are interpretable. And this particular sutra passage is the one that Tsongkhapa takes as the basis for explaining the difference between texts that are definitive and texts that are interpretable. So yeah, the two truths allows you to make sense. That was the title of my talk, right? Start making sense. Allows you to make sense of things that otherwise appear to be paradoxical and mysterious. A lot of the Perfection of Wisdom sutras, as I'm sure you know, are written in a very paradoxical way. Um, Edward Kanza, translated the Perfection of Wisdom sutras into English. He wrote probably one of the first book that I read on Buddhism is an introduction to Buddhism, but he was like riffing on the Diamond Sutra when he said in that introduction, a bodhisattva is a being compounded of two contradictory forces, that wisdom and compassion are these two contradictory forces. In in his wisdom, he sees no persons. In his compassion, he resolves to save them all. Right. And so if you take this literally, it's like, well, if there aren't any persons, it won't be a lot of trouble to save them all. So obviously that is not what is actually the intention behind this teaching. And and it doesn't seem true that wisdom and compassion are actually contradictory. But he derives this explanation of the basic Buddhist teaching as a paradox directly from the text of the Diamond Sutra, which yeah seems to say that yeah the reason we have can have compassion for beings is because we see no beings, and the yeah. So, in other words, at the surface level, there are many crucial texts that present as completely um, paradoxical, and we can make sense of those if we understand them in terms of the teachings of the two truths. Also, it helps remind people that, all of these teachers in this lineage emphasize the importance of understanding both truths. Nagarjuna says, without a foundation in the conventional truth, the significance of the ultimate cannot be taught. Without understanding the significance of the ultimate, liberation is not achieved. Right. So you need conventional truth to teach the ultimate. You need the ultimate to become liberated. And Chandrakirti says, um, 680. I don't think you've gotten to 680 yet. I'm not sure exactly where you are, but you're probably in six, but not yet to 80. Um, Conventional truth is the means, while ultimate truth is the end. Those who fail to know the distinction between the two will enter wrong paths through false conceptualizations. Right? Tsongkhapa, in the great treatise on the stages of the path to awakening, um, stresses that complete awakening or Buddhahood requires deep understanding of both truths. Because a Buddha has these two kinds of embodiment. You say a true embodiment of truth and an embodiment of form. And the embodiment of form arises from the practices of method, and these practices depend in turn upon the existence of conventional phenomena. You have to be able to make distinctions at a conventional level in order to practice virtue, for example, or to cultivate compassion by seeing that there are suffering beings. Whereas the truth body arises, embodiment of truth cannot arise without the practice of ultimate wisdom, which of course involves an understanding of ultimate reality as emptiness. So there's, when you take the structure of basis, path, and fruit, the conventional and the ultimate are the two at the basis level, and then method and wisdom at the path level, and then the embodiment of form and the embodiment of truth are at the fruition level, right? Huh. I put in the parentheses here at the end because I was thinking about, yeah, really what we mean by form bodies. The important thing is that we're able to take on forms or manifest in ways that are of maximum help in caring for other suffering beings. So one of the most important practices in Buddhism at all levels, whether you're, talking about folk level Buddhism or you're talking about, very advanced practitioners, is generosity, giving. Um, it's built into the culture of Asian Buddhism, that even people have no understanding of Buddhist philosophy will practice generosity and understand that reflexively that this is what's important in that the teacher is being generous in sharing the Dharma, and it's reciprocally important for us to be generous, right? And that giving then, and giving always involves letting go of something, right? So this is a little paragraph that my friend Jay Garfield wrote. He said, an understanding of emptiness, like the lack of intrinsic existence, enables and is reinforced by the cultivation of generosity, right? It undermines the reflexive experience of the world in terms of a subject-object duality that privileges ourselves as a subject in a unique central position and we start noticing that we have been reflexively taking our existence, our own personal existence, and as foundational to the world, and our own happiness is something that can be present or not, independent of the welfare of others. As we practice generosity, it becomes clearer and clearer that we're all companions in the world, and our happiness cannot be separated from the happiness of the beings around us. And then we begin to find ourselves spontaneously rejoicing in others' well-being. So I like this paragraph because Jay is sort of showing, probably based on his own experience, right, how generosity is so intrinsically connected to understanding emptiness. So I said something already about my connection with Jeffrey Hopkins. I mean, I've had a number of very dear Tibetan teachers, um, one of whom is still alive. And but I met them only through my connection with Jeffrey Hopkins, who's a great scholar and teacher who passed away in July of 2024. So yeah, this is an image, right? I don't know. It's pretty common. We represented. I guess it was a bit originally drawn in late 19th century Germany. Um, it's called the rabbit duck illusion. Um, and I use this as just a way to get people to think or help people get their minds around the Gelugpa presentation of the two truths. Um, what is that? Well, it's a drawing, right? But what is it a drawing of? Well, it's a drawing of a rabbit. The rabbit is facing to the right, but it's also a drawing of the duck with the duck facing to the left. They've done experiments with this drawing and showing it to little kids, and it seems that if you show it, okay, somebody has raised their hand. Let me see. I don't know what to do with that. Uh, is this a question? Maybe I could take questions later. Paloma, now many people have raised their hands. You can, what do I do with that? Let's see. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for a second, see what's going on. Is there a problem? Let's see.
It's fixed now.
It's fixed?
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry.
Okay. I didn't know if it was something that I was doing.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry.
Okay. Um, right. So this is just like a useful device for me in trying to explain the Gelugpa understanding of the two truths. Um, every object, everything that we can think of or exist or point out is depending on how you regard it or look at it, um, is an instance of both truths. Tsongkhapa says in this section, that and he uses the example of a sprout, a shoot, the beginning of a plant growing. It's like there's an entity or an aspect of of a of a of this that is known by ultimate wisdom, and that's what we mean by the ultimate truth. And there's also an aspect that's known by the reliable conventional mind, right? Which is, we call it a sprout, right? So there's a sprout and the emptiness of the sprout. And they're exactly right there together, just like this has the rabbit and the duck right there in the same object. And it's not like the rabbit's over on one side and the duck's over on the other side. It's like all rabbit and all duck all the way through, right? Yeah. But when you're beholding or seeing it as a rabbit, right, that object is from one point of view, one kind of mind is getting hold of that object. It's like that. our ordinary minds are looking around at objects and apprehending only their conventional nature, and yet the emptiness is also right there at the same time as a quality of these phenomena, a lacking intrinsic nature. It's not like emptiness is some other place. It's right in front of us all the time. But to see it, we have to have a different kind of mind. So, based on presentations such as this, in chapter 11 of this text, the Gelugpa monastic colleges for centuries have, been teaching the two truths as a topic, and it goes through the main points that are outlined in here. What is it that the two truths are two types of? Um, how are the two truths related to one another? Can there be a third truth? What is the term, what Gunzog Demba or Samvriti Satya in Tibetan and Sanskrit, respectively? What does that term mean? I mean, there are different translations, right? It's conventional truth or truth for a concealer or concealer truth. These are all different translations of the same term, sort of bringing out different aspects of its meaning. And then there's definitions of the different types of truths. So those are the main categories that are explained. And the first thing is to understand that the basis of division of the two truths is not truths, which is like, well, why isn't it? Because he said it was two truths. And it's like, well, it's not truths because, right, the conventional truths are said to be falsities rather than truths. Why are they called truths? Because they're called truths because they're truths for a concealing ignorance. They're truths for take what is taken as truths by ignorance. Sort of like if you say, oh, well, there's two kinds of gold. Um, there's real gold and then there's fool's gold. Like fool's gold, right, is some kind of substance that, you find in the ground that looks to be gold, but isn't actually gold at all, right? And in that way, it is a substance, it is in the ground, it does exist, but it's not even in the slightest bit gold, okay? But it's still called gold because it appears to be a gold to a certain kind of mind, a mind which is not able to distinguish what is really gold and what isn't. So that's how you get the idea that you're talking about two truths, but it's not a way of talking about actually two types of truth at all. Um, Also, there are many other wrong interpretations of the basis of division, both in Western scholarship and in the history of Tibetan Buddhism, according to the Gelugpa order. Um, One is to say that the two truths are two different types of perspectives. It's not that there's two different types of, they're not two different types of perspectives. They're the objects of two different types of perspectives. And everything, it includes everything in the two truths. So this point is emphasized that Sheja or Shebar Jawa or in Sanskrit it's Nyaya, that which is to be known, objects that are to be known. What is to be known? This is the basis of division. So everything that exists is one of the two truths, right? Um, it it implies, first of all, that both of these truths exist, that tables exist and the emptiness of table exists, and neither cancels out the other, which is, of course, very important in Tsongkhapa's approach. And also, it implies something about what we're trying to become. That is, mm, we're not trying to get rid of our perception that there are tables and chairs and other beings who are suffering. We're trying to understand that how our perception of those things is fails to take into account their ultimate nature. And ultimately, the goal is to become a Buddha, whereby we know all of these objects, the conventional dimension of things and the ultimate dimension simultaneously without confusing. But on along the path, we learn how to switch back and forth between these two ways of perceiving things. right? So the meeting of the Father and Son Sutra, quoted in here, Buddhas thoroughly understand both conventionalities and ultimate. And this is, in other words, these are things to be known, and Buddhas have thoroughly known these two things. Um, so yeah, Chandrakirti in this section makes it very clear that it is the object of a perceiver of reality that's the ultimate truth, and the object of a perceiver of something false is a concealer truth or a conventional truth. So there's a lot also on the relationship between the two truths. Um, they're inclusive. That is, every object of knowledge, everything that's knowable in the Gelugpa system has to be one of the two truths. There isn't any third truth. In some kinds of Chinese Buddhist philosophy, they speak of a third truth, and this third truth represents essentially the perspective of an awakening being, where the conventional truth and ultimate truth are perfectly clearly known. Um, but they aren't blended together. So in Gelugpa, the idea is that, yeah, you see both of these truths thoroughly and completely, but without mixing them up and confusing one with the other. So it's comprehensive of every object of knowledge that it's one of the two truths. And isn't anything that exists that's both, or any other objects of knowledge. So the same sutra, the Pitta Putra Samagama Sutra, he who knows the world teaches just these two truths, conventionalities and ultimate, and there is no third. They're a dichotomy. They're mutually contradictory and comprehensive um, because uh, conventional truths are deceptive and ultimate truths are non-deceptive. That is, conventional truths appear in to us, right, to exist as though they had their own nature, right? And they're deceptive in that sense. Whereas when ultimate reality can be understood in a way that's non-deceptive. So it's sort of implied by the rabbit duck illusion that I showed you earlier. The understanding of the relationship between the two truths in Gelugpa is that they are one entity, ngo chik, and yet distinct and mutually exclusive mental objects. Um, Nagarjuna's Bodhicitta Vivarana says suchness is not observed as a different entity because conventionalities are explained as empty. And emptiness is spoken of only in relationship to conventionalities. So it's certain that neither occurs without the other. So they're always right there together, even though they're mutually exclusive as mental objects. Yeah. So there's a lot of discussion about this. Why can't if the two truths are always right there together in everything that we see, we're only seeing one of them, but they're always right there together in everything we see. Yeah, why can't we say, yeah, that we're seeing the ultimate truth when we look at this book? Because it's an emptiness as well as a book. It's the emptiness of book is right there with the book. Um, well, they can't be the same because otherwise we would be, oh, okay, another person is raising their hand, so maybe there's another problem. I don't know. Otherwise, we would awaken via ordinary sense perception. Just look down at the book and you can see it very clearly. And if that's emptiness, if that is emptiness, right, then I would be seeing emptiness directly and would be far along the path to becoming a Buddha, right? On the other hand, they can't be different entities. They can't be like separate from one another, right? Because then we couldn't say that emptiness is the nature of these things. Yeah, so it's like everything that we see has certain qualities or attributes, such as like these physical objects have shape and color, and but the shape of the object is not the object, but it's always right there with the object. Um, Yeah. So many examples are given in the Sandhi-Nirmochana Sutra, actually, of um, objects and certain qualities, like the softness of cotton or the melodiousness of a musical instrument and so forth, the sweetness of honey. And so the sweetness of the honey is not the honey, and the honey is not its sweetness, but they're not separable, right? This is the idea. Well, emptiness is a quality of phenomena. It's a peculiar one, right? Because it's their ultimate quality, their ultimate nature, but it is specifically their nature of lacking any kind of findable intrinsic existence, right? So that's a special kind of quality that's in each and everything that we see. So the term conventional truth or concealer truth or truth for a concealer, um, Chandrakirti says a few different things about this. Gunzop or the concealer, samvritti, it means entirely obstructing. And it's like the term refers to ignorance. Um, Ignorance is something that covers up the suchness or the actuality of all things. But at the same time, the same term, samvritti, can mean interdependence or it can mean like worldly convention. So the translation of the term Gunzop Dempa from Tibetan um, as conventional truth is based on this third sense of the term conventional truth. Whereas if you, what do you say, take it a little bit more literally, it's a truth for a concealer, or like this idea of fool's gold that I was giving earlier. It's not actually a type of gold, but it's something that is taken to be gold by a fool. Yeah. So this is actually in um, this chapter based on Chandrakirti. Tsong says, what's found by a conventional reliable knowledge apprehending a false object of knowledge is a concealer truth. And in the case of the sprout, this is actually right here in chapter 11. The entity of a sprout that's found by a conventional consciousness comprehending an object of knowledge that's false and deceptive, that's what we mean by a conventional truth. So the nature or the aspect of a sprout or a book or anything that's found by a conventional mind, right? Right, is that it's conventional truth. Um, so there's this really crucial part that's covered in chapter 11 here of um, Chandrakirti's explaining the difference between um, mm, what kinds of things are knowable as conventional truths and what things merely appear but aren't even conventional truths. And he says objects realized by the world's apprehension via the six unimpaired sense powers are true for the world. So those are conventional truths. And yeah, other things are unreal even for the world. So, for example, the idea that a reflection of a face in a mirror is a face. It vividly appears to be a face, but even a worldly mind can realize that it's not. Right. So, what this means for Tsongkhapa and his subsequent interpreters in the Gelugpa tradition, that if a mind that is not directed toward emptiness can realize that something does not exist as it appears, then that object is unreal even for the world. If, in other words, if you can discredit something without turning your mind toward emptiness, right? You can discredit the face in a mirror being a face. You can discredit fool's gold being a type of gold. You can discredit these things without investigating emptiness. Then that object is unreal even for the world. So real and unreal in relationship to the world does not mean that there is such thing as real conventionalities. This is an important point. Uh, it does seem that some of the Svatantrika, some of the Madhyamaka authors from India, Yana Garba is an example for sure that I know. They do make a distinction between among conventionalities into real and unreal conventionalities. And and then stuff like tables and chairs and so forth come out to be real conventionalities, right? Um, and Chandrakirti and following him, Tsongkhapa and his interpreters, stress that there isn't really something that we can call real conventionalities. Conventionalities are um, uh, fundamentally unreal in that they don't exist at all the way they appear. Conventional phenomena are always false. So instead of saying they're real conventionalities in the Gelugpa tradition, they say they're conventionalities that are real in relationship to the world or real in relationship to a conventional consciousness, right? Okay. So this is a problem that comes up all the time when teaching about emptiness in the Gelugpa tradition, in the anything in the Prasangika tradition, anything in Madhyamaka. At some point, you have to deal with these kinds of questions. What do we really mean when we say that things are mere imputations or mere designations? I think in FPMT, whether it's said now or it used to be said, that things are it's a mere labeling of things, right? That's what I'm talking about. This idea that things are merely labeled. So uh, I don't know. I've had some decades now to think about this and look at different things that different scholars that have said about it. And I've especially focused on things that the Dalai Lama has said in trying to explain what mere imputation by thought means. And so I'm going to try to just share with you what I've figured out about this or feel that I've figured out. So in the great treatise on the stages of the path to enlightenment, which is the first of the five major texts on Madhyamaka philosophy um, that Tsongkhapa wrote, publishing it in 1401, based on insights that he'd reached in 1397 with the help of Manjushri about how to understand emptiness. In this text, he refutes at length all different kinds of misunderstandings about what the object of negation is. That is, when we say emptiness, what is it that lack of? Um, what is it we're supposed to refute in meditation in order to realize emptiness? And he spends a huge chunk of the text going through all different wrong ideas that people have had in the centuries before him. And then finally he comes around to say, okay, now I'm tell you what the object of negation is. And he says, there is, with regard to objects, a conception that things have an ontological status, a way of existing in and of themselves without being posited through the force of an awareness. That is, we don't think that the book that I'm looking at, Jimba's translation in front of me, it very vividly appears to be set up from its own side as a book and not being dependent upon my looking at it for it to be a book, right? The object of that conception, the idea that things just can be what they are from their own side, right, without depending on a mind designating them. The object of that conception is what we call self or intrinsic nature, right? He says hypothetical because it doesn't really exist, but we speak of it as self or intrinsic nature. To exist intrinsically or autonomously means having its own unique manner of being and way of existing on its own side, independent of its relationship to any kind of consciousness. So this is the subtle meaning of dependent arising, right? When we explain dependent arising, we start by talking about cause and effect, and then we understand the relationship of wholes as dependent on parts, and that this applies to anything that takes up space and time and goes all the way down. That is, there isn't any bottom to or fundamental partless part. But then the subtlest meaning of dependent arising is not about cause and effect or parts and wholes. It's about the relationship between minds and objects. And that's what he's saying. This is actually, what is derived from um, the 24th chapter of Nagarjuna is this understanding that this is dependent arising is the meaning of emptiness, and depending arising means mere imputation or mere designation. Yeah. So to exist intrinsically or autonomously would mean having its own way of being, to exist from its own side, rangerne truba, to exist from its own side without depending upon being designated. Ignorance, by which he means here the fundamental delusion that binds us in the cyclic existence, ignorance is a mind that instead of recognizing this, apprehends each thing as having a way to exist such that it can be known in and of itself without being posited through the force of a conventional awareness. So he's saying, yeah, the ultimate object of negation is this conception that things have their own way of existing without depending on a force of an awareness. And ignorance is a mind which binds us in cyclic existence by apprehending everything in that way. Yeah. So this is a great part of the text, but we'll sort of pass on to my trying to summarize what I've gotten out of this. First of all, if you think something like things exist as mere imputations by thought, means that there aren't objects external to the mind, then this is a Yogacara view or a Chittamatra view. Um, and it's not, or it could possibly be a Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamaka view, but it's not a Prasangika view. The Prasangika Madhyamaka view, the Chandrakirti Tsongkhapa view, is that there are conventionally existent external objects, right? It means objects that are a distinct entity from our minds. They vividly appear to us as though they exist from their own side, with that is without needing to be imputed relative to our point of view. But in fact, they exist only in dependence upon imputation, designation, or I guess you could say labeling. Therefore, things have no distinctive character of their own from within their own nature, right? Because they don't have any distinctive character or nature of their own on their own side, right? So what this means is that an object can be X from one point of view and Y from another point of view and Z from a third point of view, even when X, Y, and Z are all contradictory. In some cases, this is be completely true. The example, that comes up from the originally the Chittamatra tradition is gods, ghosts, and humans going down to the river, and the gods seeing nectar, and the humans seeing water, and the ghosts seeing a river of pus and blood or molten metal. And it's like, well, which one is right and which one is wrong? I mean, well, they're all right relative to the way that their minds have been constructed on the basis of karma. Yeah. Things exist, but they have no way, even conventionally, of existing from their own side as this or that. Therefore, they exist as mental designations or imputations relative to the point of view of a certain mind. For example, my teacher, Geshe Benden Takpa, who's now the Madhyamaka teacher for Drepung Losaling in India, he taught me that, I said, well, I don't, we go through all this and still it doesn't contradict the fact that tables are made out of atoms. And he said, oh, yes, it definitely does. If you think that a table is made out of atoms, you're thinking that the table is objectively existing and set up from its own side as as an aggregation of different particles. But he's saying, there are atoms, there are tables, but the table isn't constituted on the basis of this aggregation. The table is designated from our side in relationship to a suitable basis of designation for us. But if a spider comes along with very different kind of karma, it won't perceive a table there, right? Yeah, because there's no even though it has nothing wrong with its sense faculties, it will not perceive a table because, you know, uh, there's no objectively existent table there. There's something there. Yeah. So fundamental ignorance is a mind that regards things and persons as having some way of existing from their own side without depending on designation. Now, existing external objects do have diverse character. It's not like everything's the same. Just because nothing has any nature from its own side doesn't mean everything's the same. There are external objects and they differ from one another. Um, and these differences make them suitable or unsuitable basis of designation or valid basis for various objects. But when you try to say, well, what is that diverse character that exists out there among these objects? You can't find um, any character that it has on its own side without taking into account its relationship to a certain kind of mind, right? There isn't any independent, objective way to answer the question of what kinds of things are out there that exist separate from mind. The diverse character of external objects can be identified only relative to the perspective of particular types of beings, right? So when we look at the world and we consider what kinds of objects are there or were there in the past, what objects must have been there in order for in the past, in order for our universe to appear in this way at this time, then we can correctly designate things in accordance with their conventionally diverse character from our point of view, right? And understanding that that is not the objective nature of these things that exists on their own side, but it's just how they appear from our point of view. And beings from other realms, hungry ghosts and gods and so forth, or spiders, and other kinds of animals who have very different sorts of sense faculties, they can correctly perceive something quite different and even contradictory things, right? Because their unimpaired sense faculties, right? Their healthy sense faculties brought about by their karma are quite different, right? And therefore these things have different qualities relative to their point of view. So this is what it means to say that things don't have any nature of their own, but exist only in relationship to conventional consciousnesses. Anyway, I share that for you to chew over and think about whether you already understand it or whether you think I'm wrong. This is, yeah, the results of my efforts to understand what it means to say that things are merely labeled and yet exist as external objects. The last thing I wanted to talk about today um, is the idea that we can reliably know, we can have knowledge, reliable knowledge of conventional phenomena. They don't have any essential nature. If they're falsities and they exist one way and appear another, how can we have reliable knowledge about conventional things? And this is very important for Tsongkhapa and the Gelugpa tradition to say, yeah, we definitely can have reliable knowledge about conventional things, because if we don't, how are we going to distinguish virtue from non-virtue? And if we can't distinguish virtue from non-virtue, they're both conventionally existent phenomena. Either is emptiness, they're not emptiness. Virtue is a conventional truth and non-virtue is a conventional truth. We have to be able to know the difference between one and the other, or we'll never accumulate any merit. And then the idea of becoming a Buddha will be out the window. So, in the traditional Gelugpa education system, uh, students are exposed to this idea of valid cognition, sema, pramana, that we can reliably know this and reliably know that, um, conventional phenomena, and you learn all the definitions of different things. And, the idea seems to be that we can reliably know when we're looking at a pot because it has certain shape and certain and qualities that we can conventionally know and thereby recognize that it is a pot and so forth. Um, so this instruction is based on the teachings of Dignaga and Dharmakirti. And before students are introduced to Madhyamaka ideas and Chandrakirti and so forth, they're sort of grounded in this confidence that they can make conventional distinctions, because being able to make conventional distinctions is so fundamental to, you can't have any practice of virtue, right? Unless you have confidence that you can distinguish virtue from non-virtue. Obviously, you understand that exposing people to emptiness teachings when they're not suitable vessels to receive that can push people in the direction of nihilism sometimes, right? As people say, oh, everything's empty, therefore there isn't any distinction. Ultimately, nothing matters. It doesn't matter what I do, right? And then you have Raskolnikov or, yeah. So it feels like to me, and I actually wrote this in my dissertation, that in traditional Gillick education, students are first inoculated or vaccinated with an exposure to Dharmakirti's idea about conventional valid cognition before being exposed to Chandrakirti's ideas about emptiness. Yeah. But when you think about it like that, or if you talk about it like that, you have to be careful not to imply that Tsongkhapa and Chandrakirti have a notion about conventional reliable cognition that's just imported from Dharmakirti, to which they have added on an innocuous teaching of emptiness, which doesn't really threaten or harm or have anything to do with the fundamental fact that we can know what's a cat and what's a dog, what's virtue and what's non-virtue. Because that's not right. Um, when you bring emptiness into play and you say that nothing has any intrinsic nature, yeah, from its own side, then you can't really talk about having reliable cognition by getting at or failing to get at that objective nature. Do you see what I'm saying? Because you just finished saying things don't have any objective nature from their own side. Yeah. And in fact, many of the Tibetans, there's a lot of criticisms of Tsongkhapa from outside the Gelugpa tradition. And I would say one of the most important criticisms is this, that people that the idea that there can be reliable cognition of things that are mere falsities, that is conventional truths, um, seems completely self-contradictory to non-Gelugpas, right? And if you think and say that, oh yeah, we have reliable cognition, and that, we know that from John McCurdy, but we've added on this thing about emptiness, and it doesn't really have anything to do with our ability to reliably know conventional objects, then you actually justify Tsongkhapa's critics, right? And our ordinary sense of the world is left unscathed. They just talk about as like, okay, yeah, the world appears to me as like very solid and real, and then I put on this, thing of inherent existence is kind of, oh yeah, there's this thing called inherent existence, like a hat that's put on my head, and then I understand the emptiness arguments. And so I knocked the hat off my head again, and then I'm back where I started. And the world just exists as it appears before I even started, right? And Tsongkhapa's critics, for centuries actually down to today have said, yeah, it's incoherent to say that there's any reliable knowledge of conventional phenomena, while at the same time insisting that things are mere imputations by thought and are totally empty. So these critics insist that Chandrakirti does not assert conventional reliable cognition. And Tsongkhapa is at great pains to show that this is wrong. And I believe he's correct, but there's differences of opinion. So Tsongkhapa has this quote from Chandrakirti: reliable cognition and its objects are established through their mutual dependence. When reliable cognitions exist, then there are things that are the objects of comprehension. When there are things that are the objects of comprehension, then there are reliable cognitions. Neither reliable cognitions nor objects of their comprehension exist essentially. It seems to me that that's pretty clear and straightforward. There is such thing as reliable cognition, and it exists not by way of its own nature or essentially, but exists interdependently between the subject and the object. Yeah. At the same time, there ultimately is no reliable cognition. There's no essentially existent reliable knowledge of anything. Um, Sankaba points out a well-known passage in Chandrakirti where he says, we posit that the world knows objects with four reliable cognitions, referring to perception, inference, scripture, and analogy. And the critics of Tsongkhapa say, yeah, but he's just saying idiots in the world think that they can know objects with these kinds of reliable cognition. But that's not what Chandrakirti means. Everything that that all the conventional distinctions that we make are relative to a worldly point of view. Yeah. Ultimately, in the context of analyzing reality, there isn't any reliable cognition, but also nothing else is findable. There's no cars, there's no dogs, there's no boats, and we can't even find any absence of reliable cognition. Nothing, this is in the Heart Sutra, right, where it says, yeah, in emptiness there is no attainment and there is no non-attainment, right? You can't find either the presence or absence of reliable cognition as something that exists by its own from its own side. But like as we address each other and talk to each other and seek to share the Dharma, make arguments, use words to go shopping and hopefully come home with, food to eat. And if that's what we were seeking, we have to make conventional distinctions. And and in that context, Chandrakirti very clearly specifies that there is such thing as reliable cognition in the midst of the continuous deceptive appearance of things as inherently real, there are nonetheless reliable sources of information. And I think a good example that I've used is to think about color blindness. Like, um, yeah, red-green color blindness, for example, is a common thing in men particularly. Um, and it doesn't mean if you have red-green color blindness, that you have no possible way of knowing the difference when you come to a traffic light of whether the light is red or green. Because there's other ways of figuring out whether the light is red or green, even when you have red-green color blindness, because you have all kinds of other information. Maybe the green light is always bigger than the red light. Maybe the green light is on top or on the bottom and the red light is going to be above. I mean, you have all kinds of reliable information about the world that allows you to function even without being able to distinguish red and green. Well, it's like that. We have minds that are fundamentally and pervasively mistaken about how things exist because we're taking them to exist as they appear, and they're appearing as though they exist objectively from their own side, and they don't. So we're wrong about that. We're ontologically colorblind, but it doesn't mean we have no reliable information. The only way we can realize emptiness is to use the reliable information that we do have about the relation, how sprouts grow, or what the relationship between fire and fuel is, or whether when we throw the light switch, and turn on the light, whether that will make the room be plunged into darkness or not. Well, how do you know it doesn't? Well, because yeah, we have conventional, reliable knowledge about these things, right? And we use that knowledge in our arguments about things being empty. So the kind of reliable cognition that Chandrakirti accepts, and it operates in a different environment, that the environment of total emptiness of inherent existence. It's different from the environment Dharmakirti seems to envision. Um, Tsongkhapa quotes Chandrakirti's commentary on Aryadeva's 400. Worldly perceptions cannot cancel the perception of reality because worldly perception is reliable only for the world and because the objects it observe have a false and deceptive quality. So Chandrakirti seems to allow that if you operate within the environment of deceptively appearing objects, that is, objects that appear to exist objectively but don't, right? But within that context, we can have reliable perceptions. We can have reliable knowledge because our minds are sure to be mistaken. They're sure to be mistaken only about one thing, and that is the presence or absence of intrinsic nature in their objects. We might be mistaken about other things too, or not, right? That can be investigated. Yeah. So the question is, if Chandrakirti denies any essential character in the object for reliable cognition to apprehend, there's nothing out there, in the object for us to get at and say, I know that because I have correctly apprehended, grasped with my mind the essential character of that object, right? If there isn't any essential character in the object for the mind to grasp, then in what sense can we say that we know an object? What does it mean to say that one mind's reliable and another's not reliable when there's zero independent objective reality against which to judge the distinction between what is knowledge and what isn't? And here's where we come to chapter 6 or chapter 11 if you do the Jimba's English translation. Tsongkhapa quotes Chandrakirti as saying, perceivers of falsities are of two types, those with clear sensory faculties and those with impaired sensory faculties. A consciousness with an impaired sensory faculty is wrong in relationship to a consciousness with a good sensory faculty. Those objects known by the world and apprehended with six unimpaired sensory faculties are true for the world, and the rest are posited as unreal for the world. So when I first read this, decades ago, I didn't really understand that it had anything to do with reliable conventional knowledge or that implied an understanding of conventional reliable knowledge that's completely different from, what we were studying about Dharmakirti. But it does. It does. This is basically where we get what it means to have reliable knowledge in um, in a prasangika context. The point being that there isn't any certification of an object's nature, by a correctly ascertaining mind. Because unlike Dharmakirti, Chandrakirti never says that there's a certain mind certifying the presence or absence of some intrinsic quality in the object. Yet Tsongkhapa says that Chandrakirti and shows us convincingly that Chandrakirti does assert conventional reliable cognition, right? He asserts that there are minds that are accurate and reliable for the world, which means reliable at the conventional level. And as I pointed out earlier, besides the conventional level, there's no other level at which any positive or negative statement can be affirmed, right? There's no attainment, there's no non-attainment. So what are reliable minds in Prasangika? They're minds that are unaffected by superficial causes of error. Those unaffected by superficial causes of error cannot impeach or damage or discredit, right? Undermine, cancel out. Um, yeah. Those that are unaffected by superficial causes of error can impeach those that are. And those impaired by superficial causes of error cannot discredit those or not. That's what the Chandrakirti says. So the conventional reliable knowledge of Chandrakirti and Tsongkhapa doesn't operate by way of this certifying the presence of some character in its object. It's rather that having apprehended an object, its apprehension of that object is not falsified or discredited by some other mind. So, for example, if I think that they're look out on a hot summer day and look out across the asphalt parking lot, and I perceive that there's a pool of water over there, right? I might, if I'm haven't been in that situation too often, think that there is actually water on the pavement, right? But if I come closer and closer, that apprehension of a pool of water will be discredited, and I'll realize that it's an optical illusion that arises from the heat rising off the pavement, creating the appearance of water, but and that falsifies or discredits that earlier apprehension. Yeah. So do you see what I'm saying? It's that there's an apprehension which is or isn't later discredited or falsified. And if there's an apprehension that exists and nothing discredits or falsifies it, right, then it can operate as knowledge for the time being, at least. So it's not that testimony is notarized by an impression of the aspect of some nature that's there in the object, because there is no objective nature in the object. Wrong, nor true, there's nothing from the object's own face or from its own side. Rather, knowledge is reliable when it stands unimpeached. It hasn't been discredited. Like if you think that things are inherent existent, that can be discredited by an analysis of emptiness, right? And if you think that there's an oasis in the desert, right, and it's just an optical illusion, right, then as you get closer and investigate more carefully, that perception of apprehension of an oasis will be discredited. We have experiences like this all the time. We know all the time we make mistakes about what things are. And then when we see them from a different angle, or we see them up close, or we ask a few questions, we investigate more carefully, we find out that what we thought was true isn't true, wasn't actually true at all, ever. So what Tsongkhapa says, and this is actually in the Great Treatise, but Jimba quotes it in the introduction to this translation. Um, Tsongkhapa says, we hold that something exists conventionally if it's known to a conventional consciousness, if no other conventional reliable cognition contradicts its being as it's thus known, and if the reason that accurately analyzes reality, that is, analyzes whether something intrinsically exists or not, does not contradict it. And what fails to meet those criteria does not exist at all. Right. That's what he says. So, I mean, right. Yeah. You can make all kinds of explorations of how much you like or don't like this as a theory of what it means to know something. Um, But this is Prasangika epistemology. It's like outside of Gelugpa, they insist that to be a Prasangika means to reject epistemology, means to reject any theory about the possibility of knowing this world in which everything, appears to us falsely. And Sankara is like, no, that can't be. We have to be able to know things in this world, even though they're appearing to us falsely. And how can he explain that? This is how he explains it. And the basis for his explaining it this way is exactly right here in chapter 6. I think it's verse 22, right? Right. A conventional existence is not defined by an incontrovertible certification of perception or inference. Tsongkhapa follows Chandrakiri in delineating the class of existing objects by first placing in view all objects, every object that's apprehended by a conventional mind, and then seeing which of those apprehensions can be impeached, right? Either by another conventional mind or by an ultimate analysis. Yeah. So to put it in a different way, within the broad sphere of what living beings are apprehending, things that cannot be found to be delusory, cannot be ruled out, are exactly what we can take, at least for the time being, as existing. It's always possible that further investigation later on, we may have found that we made a mistake. Yeah. So in epistemology, the idea that there's a correspondence between our inner perception and the nature of out there in the object, right? That there's a correspondence theory of knowledge. I mean, I feel that this is my opinion that Dharmakirti does have a correspondence theory of knowledge, but Chandrakirti's theory of knowledge, which Tsongkhapa adopts, is coherentist or pragmatic rather than correspondence theory. You can't try to find a match between your inner perception and the outer nature. And that being the case, whatever it is we suppose we know may later have to be revised. Yeah. So in this regard, yeah, I quoted the famous Pali Canon verse. Yeah, when the people, the Kalamas, were asking the Buddha, how do we know which guru to believe and which one not believe? He said, when you know for yourselves that these qualities are skillful and these are blameworthy, right? When these qualities, when adopted and carried out, lead to harm and suffering, then you should abandon those, right? In other words, it's a pragmatic, he doesn't say investigate what the real nature of those things are. You say it's a pragmatic understanding of what's virtue and what's non-virtue. And this is like, I'm not saying it is, I'm saying it's like science. Science is also an evolutionary process of knowing. Karl Popper, a philosopher of science, said science is an evolutionary process in which hypotheses or conjectures are imaginatively proposed and then tested in order to explain facts or resolve problems. So there's an instability in science about like, right, which people don't understand. There's lack of a final or absolute certainty about what constitutes scientific knowledge, right? Because things that we think we know might turn out to have been wrong. But this doesn't mean there isn't any knowledge at all. It's not a quagmire. This is the fact that our apparent knowledge may turn out to have been wrong is what makes evolutionary progress possible. It's what makes improvement possible in medicine, for example, or in the spiritual path. Yeah. So for whatever purpose we have, whether it's becoming a Buddha or having a better medicine for some chronic disease, we can always seek improvements to the methods through which we pursue it and the beliefs that we hold that are associated with those methods. Even things that are very widely believed. It's hard for me to not use the example because it's so pervasive in classical Buddhist texts of the idea that being a woman is an inferior rebirth, right? The word for woman in Tibetan, Gyemen, means an inferior birth, right? A lesser birth. So these are things that are widely believed, right? Even things that are very widely believed can be discredited through the further use or amplification, further analysis of the evidence that's before us. So when we impeach past beliefs and we abandon behaviors that are associated with those beliefs, we can refine our ways of living or our modes of meditative practice, you know, better suited to our situation, including our bodies and our minds and our total environments. Apparently successful interactions with other living beings in the environment lead to acceptance as conventional fact of the presumptions that are behind a new method of acting. That's basically what the Buddha seems to be teaching. Um, yeah. So we're always working with what we know or believe we know so far. And the things that the beliefs that we've adopted based on practices that seem to be successful, right? They stand as fact. They have verisimilitude, that is the appearance of truth. They're workable. They can be treated as truth for the time being until they might be discredited later by some further deployment or enhancement through, say, a telescope or a microscope that was stronger from any, natural senses that people had. of the unimpaired observer's conventional faculties, right? So the Dalai Lama, in this way, he understands this and he advocates the refinement of knowledge. If science proves that something is something different from what we find in the Buddhist scripture, he said several times, we can reasonably trust science, understanding that Buddha was skillfully teaching in terms of what his audience understood at that earlier time. About, for example, about the geography of the world or the distance to the moon and so forth. Yeah. Scientific knowledge is itself likewise revisable and is always being revised. So yeah, we might revise our understanding of the distance to the moon based on science rather than on scripture, but then later find out that the science was off. It's always possible, right? So there's a congruence. I like this word. There's a congruence between the scientific method and the successive refinement that takes place in Buddhist mind training, right? Yeah. In each case, you start with certain models or presumptions about how to proceed, what matters, how the world works, what seems to be helpful, and working with the received and evolving tradition. This would be the Dharma as it comes to us. These models are refined and sometimes superseded through some subsequent insight or discovery. That's what Lamrim, the stage of the path, is gradually transforming the mind, culminating in awakening. This depends upon the idea of progress and very gradual progress, right? It depends on the possibility of improvement as distinct from the idea that we're all perfectly awakened from the very beginning. And also, it's distinct from a view in which the conventional just means whatever most folks are saying. Yeah, majority rule. I am ready to take questions.
Thank you so much, Professor. We would like to open up the questions to the master's program students which are in the room. So if there's questions in the room, please turn on the camera and the microphone. And then if time allows, we can also open the questions to the chat. I will open the chat now to everyone. And you can drop your questions there, and then I'll read them out loud.
Looks like Massimo might be talking, but he's muted. Okay. No. Yeah.
Okay, I think there is a question on the master's program student room. So
Um, is it in the chat or?
they will speak on the microphone, hopefully.
Okay.
I don't know if anyone's speaking. Can you wave there on the room? Yeah. No? Okay. Okay, then whoever has questions, please drop it in the chat.
Uh, it seems that maybe there are some questions. B and Terrell have put things in the
I
chat.
think you might be able to unmute yourselves. You can try. Terrell, you can go first.
Not allowed to unmute. You have to give people permission
Yeah,
to.
yes, we had a few problems. Give me 1 minute. Sorry. I don't know how to do this actually. Hmm?
Uh,
Get out. Where? Where?
Can you hear me?
yes.
Okay, so Terrell has asked, hi, I'm an MP student online and have a question. Is it best to unmute? Oh, that's not the question. Yeah, we don't need that. I'm asking the questions online. Okay, so yeah, but Terrell has to ask. I'm to the students, to the people who are online, I can read out your questions, but then you have to actually type them. Okay, so
There are two people who've
yeah.
typed questions now.
Okay, so let's go next. Lobsang Sultram, how would you explain the chief differences between Tsongkhapa and Gorampa's understanding of the two truths?
Yeah, well,
Good luck.
so this this idea, one of the most important differences is this idea of whether it's possible to have knowledge of conventional things. And Karamba is one of the most influential critics, from a Gilligan point of view, needing to be responded to critics of this idea that it's possible to have conventional, reliable knowledge within the Prasangika system. So let me just, I've explained it as clearly as I could from a Gelugpa point of view. If you look at it from Karamba's point of view, it said, okay, well, you've said, first of all, that conventional truths are things that are deceptive, and the deceptive and the non-deceptive are mutually contradictory. And so if all these conventional phenomena are deceptive, and that is what they share, then it's absurd to talk about reliable cognition of things that are basically deceptive, right? Um, and that furthermore, the idea that you would know these things by getting at some character that they had would be contradictory to the idea that everything is empty of some essential character from its own side. This is one of the most vexed differences between Karmapa and Tsongkhapa, right? And so I was trying to articulate Tsongkhapa's position in a way that takes into I mean, I'm trying to explain how a defender of Tsongkhapa would respond to that, without actually bringing Koramba into the discussion because it seemed complicated enough as it is. But yeah, that's the basic difference. And Tsongkhapa's answer to that is like, well, yeah, all of these conventional phenomena are deceptive, but they're deceptive about one particular thing. And what they're deceptive about is the idea of there being some essential nature on their own side. But it doesn't mean everything about them is necessarily deceptive, right? That we can, um, let me see, right now, there's the book in front of me is appearing to me, even to my senses, as though it were objectively, inherently set up from its own side as a book. It's also appearing to me as a book. It's also appearing to me as being a certain size, a certain shape, a certain color. There's a lot of things that are appearing to me, right? And Sanka will say, well, you know, it doesn't mean that everything, every aspect of that, it's not that everything that you see is wrong just because there's a wrong aspect in everything you see. That's why I was trying to use the example of the colorblind person. We're ontologically colorblind. We see things wrongly in terms of what the nature of their way they exist is, but it doesn't mean that everything that we perceive about them is wrong. it is correct to say, uh, you know, that there's a book here. It's correct as long as I understand it. I'm not saying that there's objectively existent a book from its own side that has its own book nature, which is projecting itself toward my senses. No, it's just, yeah, it's practical that there are pages that I can turn and I can read in it. Um, like if there weren't, Tsongkhapa would say, if there isn't any knowledge at all, how are we living? How are we surviving? How can we know what to eat and what not to eat? You know, that's maybe I interpret this as what the Buddha is saying to the Kalamas. You should make practical distinctions based on your life. That's what Chandrakirti is saying. Yeah, there's within the world, it is possible to know this or to know that. Um, There are other differences, but in this context, that's the most important difference, I think. And it's not just Koramba. Uh, I mean, Mipam will say the same thing. I mean, it's the whole range of Tsongkhapa's critics in Tibet, and also Westerners who are followers of those non-Gelugpa teachers. Um, they find they find some Tsongkhapa's presentation to be absurd and self-contradictory on the issue of reliable knowledge. That's why I wanted to try to explain it, or implicitly to defend it. Okay, there's a lot of things in the chat. Should I go to that or is somebody else going to speak? Let's see.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so the next question that was in the chat after that was from Tutanjolma, and it is, the Buddhist tenets are thought to be a development, a refinement in view. Do you think that the Prasangika view is the last in that development? Might there be another refinement possible?
I know I saw that question in the chat. Yeah. I don't know. Honestly, I mean, uh, yeah. Okay, this is the way I'll put it. Um, it's like the tenet systems are formulations, um, systemizations that the Tibetans have put together based on many, 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 many different teachings from very many different Buddhist teachers over actually thousands of years, right? When you talk to like a lot of Western scholars who are not involved in tenet system research, they tend to discourage people from relying on tenet literature because they think it oversimplifies the differences among, say, we have a category called Svatantrika Madhyamaka, right? And it's like, yeah, well, there's lots of different people who fit in that category who hold different things. So the framework I would refer to is the medical metaphor. Um, these are all the tenet systems are useful formulations of some of the main medicines that we know in the Dharma pharmacy. Um, uh, and if you were going to say, well, there's this other medicine that's even better than Prasangika, it would be a problem to say, well, like where are you maybe like for example, maybe you're deriving it from tantras that you think supersede everything that's in all the sutras and shastras. Do you know what I'm saying? Like what's the basis for it in the Buddhist tradition would be one question. But uh I think it's important to understand that like for some people different tenet systems are best for some people at some points in their lives. And for some people, many people, the Prasangika system is not the best medicine. Um, so I would say they're better medicine or worse medicine relative to whose experience. And there's always people for whom the Prasangika system will not be the best medicine. Yeah. That's all I can do with that. Sorry.
Okay, the next one down is, do you think that there are similarities between the Buddhist epistemology and the Kantian one?
I don't think I really know enough about Kant to answer that well. I my knowledge about Western epistemology has been obtained mostly secondhand through hanging out with a lot of Western philosophers uh, and then thinking about how to conceptualize in Western terms what Tsongkhapa's epistemology is. Um, so I don't know. I think even when you say Kant, that as soon as you say Kant, there's like 4 or 5 people in the department from which I retired who study Kant, and they have different opinions about what Kant was actually saying. So yeah, I think I probably would have to just say I don't know. I think the words that I used were ones that I have confidence in, that in terms of Western epistemological vocabulary, first of all, I would say that Tsongkhapa does have an epistemology, which many of the Western scholars who are relying on Koramba, for example, say that no, this is the rejection of epistemology. That's what they say, right? So that Tsongkhapa has an epistemology, that Prasangika has an epistemology, that Chandrakirti is explaining right in the 6th chapter here what that epistemology is. And that it's not a coherent, it's not a correspondence theory because there isn't any objective nature to match up with our perception out there in the object. That it's coherentist in the sense that we have intuitions or ideas about how things exist and we relate them to other things that we know and we see whether they work in practice. So it's pragmatic and coherentist. It's not any kind of correspondence theory. That's pretty much all I can say. I don't know if that's how people understand Kant or not.
Okay, the next one, I will try to give a direct translation as best I understand it. So, the mental representations generated by a mind, can these have an effect on the representations generated by other minds?
Uh,
And then the final question is, if I'm understanding correctly, therefore, what mental representations should one generate?
um, okay. Well, in general, the first question, um, when things appear to us in a certain way, that's a mental representation. Um, and if we act in a way that's based on that representation, and our action seems to be achieving the intended result, right? Then we will articulate this as the way things really are. And in some cases, that can be powerfully influential on other people. And right. And so there's a direct, yeah, we can communicate our way of perceiving the world. Um, and sometimes even without, using words, it may be possible for people to see the world, to act on the basis of their perceiving the world in a certain way, such that other people are influenced by them to act in a similar way, and therefore to adopt beliefs that are consistent with those practices. So in general, I would say that's true. We're social beings. We influence each other in direct and indirect ways. Um, and then what's the second part is,
The second part was, and sort of as a consequence, and so what kind of mental representations to generate?
oh, oh, yeah. Well, it's like what the Buddha said to the Kalamas, people are th throwing all different kinds of ideas about at you, right? And I think uh, you feel yourself drawn karmically or however you feel yourself drawn to a certain way of describing reality or representing things. And and then if you proceed on that basis, right, and the results seem to be good in terms of generating happiness for yourself and others, then yeah, you can persist in that. But I think it's wise to uh, be open is the right word, right? Is say be open. Chandrakirti, it says like, things like Tsongkhapa spells it out very clearly. Yeah, the things that we think we know might turn out to be not exactly right later on. Yeah. Like, yeah, His Holiness saying, yeah, we have to rely on the word of the Buddha and it's in the sutras. But when the Buddha says the distance to the moon is a certain amount, well, we have to realize that that could be subject to interpretation, right? So, uh, the whole idea that we can adopt a certain way of looking at the world, a certain way of representing the world in our minds, and just lock into that and stay with it forever and say, now I have the right view, absolutely. I think we do have to commit ourselves to a certain way of seeing the world that and acting on the basis a way in which when we act on the basis of it, we find it to be helpful to ourselves and others. But at the same time, we have to have an openness to be able to refine that as our experience grows.
Okay, the next one, Paolo is citing illumination, saying Buddha has a dualistic appearance that is not mistaken with respect to its appearing object. So it's an unmistaken dualistic appearance. How can
Mm.
we understand this assertion?
Well, first of all, let me say that all the teachings about how the Buddha perceives the world are they're the so you know well that Gelugpa has a certain way of talking and explaining things, this system. And it's it's a way that is very well developed for, I think, um, our point of view, that is our ordinary point of view. It's not a way of talking that takes absolute non-dualism as its starting point, right? It starts out by saying, yeah, let's make some clear distinctions here, right? That's how Gelugpa operates all the way along, right? And that being the case, the farther you go along the path, the more difficult it becomes to fit the kinds of experiences and the kinds of minds you're trying to describe in terms of that basically dualistic conceptual vocabulary of Gelugpa becomes more and more difficult to make that coherent. Now that's true in general, and that's why it's almost always said that the Buddhist way of perceiving the world is inconceivable. That doesn't stop Gelugpas from trying their best to present a conceivable way of imagining the inconceivable because they cannot be stopped. Do you know what I'm saying? This is what they do. And so in the textbooks I've read, they will do their very best to answer conundrums like this, and then well, eventually they'll come up against a kind of problem that they can't really produce an answer that convinces themselves. And then they'll say, Chebar Jiao, and say, this remains to be analyzed by the next generation to work out exactly how to describe that. So, and people claim, and I don't know how much use it is, but that, if you look at a Kagyupa presentations, there's more speaking from the point of view of the path, and in Nyingma, there's more speaking from the point of view of the fruition, and so they don't try to have like the same kind of degree of logical coherence because they have a way of speaking that's grounded in evoking experience that goes beyond logic, right? So this is a I just point this out that um you also I would just say this one final thing. It's like I can try to answer that question, but I don't know how fruitful it is because um how does it help? Do you know what I'm saying? The whole point of this is to try to help to be kinder. And I don't really find it too helpful to get into the conundrum about the inner workings of omniscience. Um, if you want to, the best that I've done with it is the 12th chapter of my book, The Two Truths, which analyzes all the differences among the different Gelugpa monastic colleges in terms of how they explain the two truths. And in the end, I deal with these issues about how are we going to try to explain the riddles of omniscience in terms of a clear, coherent Gelugpa language. And honestly, I don't think that they ever solve all the problems. I don't believe that they do. I don't believe that they can because it's inconceivable.
Okay, there's a long list. Okay.
Hello?
Yeah, someone in the room wants to ask a question.
Hey, Professor Newland. First of all, thank you very much for this very interesting, quite a lot of material to think about lecture. I wanted to ask something that actually I've been thinking about and asking, in a way, the same question to different teachers because I want to hear different perspective and answers on that. And this is maybe more about a gross level of those things. Um, in a debate that I had with a student, not from here, from the master program, but in the past regarding to, how we should look at things, within the conventional and ultimate truth about, for instance, and the working of karma in that regard as well, is if, for instance, I see a dog that is wounded and I would want to help him. I mean,
Mm,
conventionally, I see this wounded dog and I would
mm,
want to help him. His answer in the conversation about ultimate truth and karma that we had is that if I help him, I'm endangering of letting this dog experience the exhaustion of his negative karma. And I mean, I sometimes hear reactions about, but things are empty, and so on and so forth, about when conventional truth is a bit more um, painful, or
mm,
should I engage in an action that could, you know, I in my label it is positive, but could look like negative if I don't have an omniscient mind, and so on and so forth. And I would really like to ask your opinion about this, because how can we even create merit if we don't engage in actions that we label as positive? Or, the question of morality and so on and so forth as well coming into that context. Thank you so much.
right. Well, I think this is a very important question. And I have to interpret your question a little bit in order to answer it. I think what you're saying is like that people will say, well, okay, you have this dog that appears to be suffering, and there's two problems. One is ultimately it's neither suffering nor not suffering because it doesn't have any intrinsic nature. And two, if you were to help the dog, maybe you're actually harming the dog because you're failing to allow it to experience the complete fruition of the bad karma that led to its being born as a dog and then further being injured, right? Okay, so starting with the latter point, I'm not buying it. Like if another being around us is suffering and we have the power and the opportunity to be helpful, we should try to do so. And it doesn't have to do with our making judgments about how that affects or doesn't affect the other being's karma. It's like it's like we're going to do what's virtuous to the best that we can, in different circumstances. That's different according to our capacities and the total situation. But we should do what we regard as helpful to the other beings. That's our choice. That's our karma, right? And it's not. I refuse to accept that helping the dog is actually in that situation is particularly harming the dog. And also the other argument that because everything's empty, right? It doesn't really matter whether you help the dog or not. This is like fundamentally contradictory to Tsongkhapa's entire project, which is to try to say that the ultimate nature of things, that they lack intrinsic existence, does not cancel out or supersede the conventionally reliable distinctions, even when they're difficult to make, between what's virtuous and non-virtuous. Because if they did, then you wouldn't have the idea of the Buddha being the best possible helper of all beings, right? Because the Buddha would just be gone into emptiness land, right? And there wouldn't be any way of thinking about the Buddha as a helper, right? So, in practical terms, I think the practice of the path is to try to be motivated by loving care, which is grounded in an understanding of our not having a nature which is intrinsically different from the other beings around us, and that of trying to become as 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 good as we can, as Buddha-like as we can, in the sense of being better helpers, more skillful in our help to other beings. So sometimes people have very good intentions and they feel a moral obligation to help, but it could be that their interventions are unskillful and actually cause harm, right? That could be the case, right? So part of trying to be the best possible helper is not just having good intentions, but becoming more knowledgeable and more skilled about what kinds of actions are actually helpful to people or dogs in which kinds of situations. And there's always seems to be more to learn, right, about that. There's more refinements that can come about in terms of our understanding about how to be skillful in helping other people. One aspect of that is understanding impermanence, is understanding dependent arising, is understanding emptiness. That's one aspect of becoming more skillful, right? And another aspect of it is learning more about practicalities of how the world works and how our world works and how it's helpful to interact with different kinds of beings. So that's what I see as the practice of the path, that the whole idea of preserving, Tsongkhapa took one of the main messages that he got from Manjushri is to value appearances, to take conventional reality seriously, right? And that's what the force of his reading of Prasangika Madhyamaka is to say, emptiness, what does it really mean? It means how the fact that things are dependent arisings. It does not cancel out the existence of things. It doesn't mean that nothing matters. That's the thrust of Tsongkhapa's interpretation of Prasangika Madhyamaka. And other people read Chandrakirti and find completely different things, I have to say. Yeah. In some sense, Jimba in his introduction acknowledges that Chandrakirti the texts are amenable to readings other than the one Tsongkhapa has given. I find the more I look at this, the more persuaded I am that Tsongkhapa is actually right. But the problems that he was solving in his world at his time in the beginning of the 15th century were really different than the ones that Chandrakirti was dealing with, centuries before in India. And so he does, approach things differently. And in that way, the text is open to other interpretations.
Just one more thing to ask about this in that regard. For the second part of what I was also wondering about is, since, for instance, myself, I don't have an omniscient mind. I don't know everything. I'm trying, I'm learning and do the best that I can. But
Yeah.
also sometimes when I have the possibility, for instance, I know I have teaching the summer school for kids. Well, I
Yeah.
try to do the best that I can, or even nurses or doctors. I guess, I mean, some of them, I'm assuming, don't have an omniscient mind, but they still engage in practicing of helping to the best of their abilities. So,
Exactly.
I mean, you still you still engage even though you're still learning. I mean, I guess it's also a way of collecting merit in that regard, no?
Yeah, of course, none of us, I'll just take it that none of us has an omniscient mind here. Maybe somebody does and we don't know, but, um, yeah, so it's not only that sometimes we'll be less than perfectly skillful in helping others. It's like sometimes we will, with best intentions, inadvertently do things that actually harm. Um, and so we have to be, we shouldn't be righteous. We shouldn't be self-righteous about our going around doing good, right? Because even if we have the very best of intentions, we always have more to learn about how to be skillful. And it means that, yeah, sometimes it's almost certain, it's uncertain that we'll make mistakes. We have to recognize them and learn from them. A lot more questions that I haven't answered. Should I just start reading out of the chat or is somebody?
Well, we're mindful also of your time.
Uh, well, I'm not tired of talking, but just my voice is getting a little hoarse, but otherwise I'm fine.
Then we'll carry on.
Okay.
Okay, so there are more questions both in the room and online, but let's go back to online. Okay, so the next one, this is a follow-up from a question asked earlier. Could someone close the door, please? Taking the difference between Gorampa and Tsongkhapa's view of the two truths, how does this then carry through to the development of the wisdom understanding emptiness?
Well, I'll try to answer this from instead of answering it from a defender of Tsongkhapa point of view, I'll answer it from a kind of more of a Dalai Lama ecumenical point of view. The Dalai Lama has written many things about how he believes that there are awakened beings in all the major traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, right? Including Kagyapa, for example, right? And from a, traditional, very orthodox Gelugpa point of view, that might be questioned because if you have a wrong view of the two truths, that is to say, a view that is based in a critique of Tsongkhapa, how could you be correctly realizing emptiness and becoming an awakened being, right? Um, but let's look at it like this. We know that uh, we have to be able to talk about conventionally reliable knowledge because we can go to the store and make a conventional distinction between a product that we want to purchase and a product that we don't, or and we can find food and not, accidentally come home with a bag of rocks. Do you see what I'm saying? And it's like, yeah, we would be dead. We wouldn't exist. Evolution would have been impossible. We couldn't be here if it weren't possible for us to have some reliable conventional knowledge about the objects that are around us and how to interact with them, right? And so on that basis, if we have some conventionally reliable knowledge, why don't we expand and refine and extend that into seeing how we can generate happiness for ourselves and others as best possible, right? That's the way Tsongkhapa proceeds, and not let the fact that everything is ultimately empty undermine our practice of improving our care for ourselves and others. Yeah. But from the Khaoa side, they'll say, look, you have acknowledged that all of these things are appearing to us deceptively. And what you're doing is by saying, yeah, no, I mean, it's a book. We know it's a book. It's just that we got confused about whether it has intrinsic nature or not, but it's really a book. And it's like, so they see the Gelugpa way as like confirming the naive perception of the world as objectively set up in the way that it appears, and that you have to, in order to undermine that naive and deluded perception of that things exist as they appear, you have to be very, very strongly grounded in the idea that these things do not exist as they appear, that they're false and delusory. And when you read Tsongkhapa talking about conventional truth, he repeatedly does say that. He follows Chandrakirti in saying, these are false and delusory things. They're falsities. Conventionalities are falsities, right? Um, so Tsongkhapa understands that. But as the Gelugpa tradition goes on, right, there tends to become a more emphasis on conventional validity rather than on falsity. Do you know what I'm saying? And you can get to a point where it's sort of like, yeah, everything is as it appears. Oh, except that it has this quality of emptiness, which is a little bit difficult to realize. So don't worry about it. Or yeah, later on you can understand emptiness, and you'll understand that there's this mistaken thing called adherent existence that's like extra on top of stuff, and then we'll give you a meditation to take it off again, and you'll be left with a cup is a cup, a book is a book, right? So from Enigma point of view, I'm talking about MIPOM, or from Karamba's point of view, these are um, the Galupa way of talking can be perceived as reinforcing rather than critiquing and undermining our grasping of things existing as they appear. And then you say to them, well, when you go to the store, you don't come home with a bag of rocks when you were meaning to buy food. So you must have some conventional, reliable knowledge. And they'll say, no, it's true that, practically within this world of deceptive appearances, you know, we can do things that are more or less effective, but we can't claim that we actually know. Like I was thinking, if you don't have any way, if you're just going to rely upon your faith in the Lama, how do you know which Lama to rely on? If you don't have, it's like, I don't have any conventional reliable knowledge, but I know I can trust this Lama. Well, how do you know you can trust the Lama if you don't have any conventional reliable knowledge? It's all based on your mental perceptions, your sense perceptions, and how you internally process those. You develop a sense of confidence. It has to be based on some kind of knowledge. I think that the Gelugpa way just makes more sense, and it's focused on making more sense. But is making sense always the most important thing? Do you know what I'm saying? Maybe sometimes things that make a little bit less sense are actually more helpful to some people. That's where I started with the root metaphor is the Dharma is a pharmacy. It's a pharmacy. It's not a single medicine. This is the wrong medicine. If the Dalai Lama believes there are awakened beings in all the four major traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, then he has to have a way of explaining, which he spends a lot of time working on, how these words, which appear totally wrong from a Gelugpa point of view, can nonetheless be getting at the emptiness that he believes is real, right? Do you know what I'm saying? It's like you can use very different words to point people in the same direction, and sometimes words that appear to be contradictory could actually be skillful ways of helping different people toward the same understanding.
Okay, so I'll continue, and then if you need to go, you tell me, and we stop. All right. So I'll be led by Okay, is
Yeah.
that all right? Okay.
Yeah.
The next one we have is, how did Tsongkhapa include pure phenomena perceived by pure perception with our system's two truths?
Right. Right. It's good point. Good question. Yeah. Yeah. I don't really know. I mean, I understand it's a serious problem. Um, yeah. Because say the pure appearances of the Pure Land, um, these are conventional truths. Yeah. But the beings to whom the awakened beings to whom they appear, um, don't have any false and deceptive appearances. Um, you could say that, yeah, these pure phenomena are falsities because they don't exist as they appear relative to the unawakened beings who have the opportunity to perceive these pure phenomena through the power of the Buddha or advanced bodhisattva. I know that's another example of the kind of conundrum that you get into when you try to put the Gelugpa presentation of the two truths, which is, very clear from our level, and you try to translate it up to the advanced levels of the path or to the level of omniscience. And there come to be a lot of problems. I just personally feel that is one of the problems, but that's just my opinion. I don't know.
And the next question is, in order to avoid the extreme of nihilism, wouldn't it be clearer if emptiness is always referred to as emptiness of true existence / inherent existence to identify precisely what is being negated?
Um, yeah, probably. Um, I'm just thinking how Tsongkhapa writes. A lot of times in Tibetan, in Tsongkhapa's texts, he uses tekonani, uh, which means just thatness or suchness, or yeah, usually it's translated as suchness or just thatness more literally. So the actuality of things, the actual way that things are, without any false superimposition from our minds, from delusion, the actuality of things. And in other words, when you look in the Tibetan, in Tsongkhapa's texts, he doesn't use dongbani, the word for emptiness, as much as you would expect. Let's put it that way, right? And he does a lot of times talk about the absence of things having a nature that's established by way of its own character. And that's a very long phrase, but he uses it repeatedly. Or as a way to point to that without using a long phrase, he'll say, tekonani, the actuality of things. So um, it's not that he never uses dongbani, just emptiness in a freestanding way, but I don't know. Yeah, it's true that uh, it's not the way that he usually writes in Tibetan. That might fit with the implication of your comment.
Okay, so the mudra of wrapping up has been expressed.
Uh-huh, uh-huh,
So
uh-huh,
those of us with questions, and some of us still have, but we just, otherwise we'll never finish. So
uh-huh,
the mudra has been shown, and
uh-huh.
so we really want to, I mean, I'll speak on behalf of the students and say thank you so much for your patience and generosity in giving this extensive presentation and the generosity of your time in answering our questions as well. We could probably continue asking questions until tomorrow. But for now, thank you so very much for everything and for all your generosity. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoy it. I'm retired now. So even when I wasn't retired, I didn't have these conversations with my students because they're all beginners. And so I really like having this opportunity to talk about people, talk with people who are seriously engaged in trying to work these things out. It's a joy to me. And apparently I have a return date already set up with you for, I guess, in October sometime, right?
Yes.
So,
We'll look
okay.
very forward to welcome you again in the near future. Thank you so much, Professor, for this incredible session. And the link for for your article has been sent in the chat. We also apologize for the unexpected problems we experienced during the session, and all of them have been reported to the Zoom. And for those interested in further study, the FPMT Master's Program at Lama Tsongkhapa Institute offers a full-time opportunity to study Tibetan Mahayana Buddhism, integrating academic study, practice, and service. To learn more about the master's program, you can scan this QR code here, and the recording of today's sessions will be uploaded on our website. The link was also sent on the chat. And to stay informed about the upcoming events, about Professor's return and other MP talks, please sign up for our newsletter, also with the QR code here. So thank you again for your participation, and we look forward to welcome you to our next event.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
everybody.
Thank you.
All right.